Canada is holding the leverage in the latest trade fight because President Donald Trump's fertilizer threats could hit U.S. farms first, not Ottawa. American agriculture depends heavily on Canadian potash to maintain modern crop yields, which means any new tariff pressure would land directly on farmers, input costs, and food prices in the United States. That is the part Washington does not get to spin away with a few tough posts and a round of gaslighting. Potash is not some side issue in the farm economy. It is a core ingredient in large-scale crop production, especially for corn, soybeans, and wheat. Industry data show the United States relies on Canada for the vast majority of its potash imports, making the supply line both cheap and strategically exposed. So while Trump talks about using fertilizer as a pressure point, the math points in the other direction. Canada controls a critical input. The U.S. cannot easily replace at scale, at least not without higher costs and slower logistics. That gives Ottawa a real bargaining chip, and it puts American growers in the awkward position of paying for a trade fight they did not start. For farmers, this is not a theoretical policy debate or a Beltway Karen argument about leverage. Potash helps crops absorb water and nutrients more efficiently, which is why it sits inside the economics of yield, not just the politics of trade. If the supply gets taxed, the first bill does not go to Canada's cabinet table. It goes to U.S. farm operations already running on thin margins. That is why Trump's fertilizer threat looks less like a power move and more like a self-inflicted hit on the domestic side. The United States can threaten tariffs, but Canada sits upstream in the supply chain, and that changes the whole game. The cheapest lifeline is the one the market depends on most. And right now that lifeline runs north. What happens when the cheapest lifeline gets taxed? Canada's grip on potash is not a side note in this trade fight. It is the whole board. Potash is one of the few fertilizer inputs that cannot be casually swapped out without hitting yields, because crops need potassium to regulate water use, nutrient uptake, and overall resilience during the growing season. That is why the market treats potash as a strategic commodity rather than a simple farm product. According to industry and government data, there is no broad, low-cost substitute that can be deployed at scale without forcing farmers to change their fertilizer programs, absorb higher input costs, or accept lower productivity. In practical terms, that means any disruption lands fast on the farm ledger and then rolls downstream into food prices. The U.S. does have domestic potash production, but the reserve base is thin compared with Canada's, and the economics are weaker. American deposits are limited, more expensive to develop, and not positioned to replace imported volumes quickly. If trade friction tightens supply, that leaves Washington with a familiar problem. It can talk tough on tariffs, but it cannot print a new mine, a new rail line, or a new processing chain overnight. Canada, by contrast, sits on one of the world's strongest potash endowments, and Saskatchewan is the engine room. The province hosts the bulk of Canada's production, with large-scale operations built for export, not just domestic use, which gives Ottawa and Prairie producers a structural advantage in any price or policy shock. According to Natural Resources Canada and industry reports, Canada is the world's largest potash exporter, and Saskatchewan dominates the country's output by a wide margin. That dominance matters because scale is not just about volume, it is about reliability. Canadian producers can move product through established rail and port networks, while U.S. buyers have long depended on that steady flow to keep fertilizer inventories balanced ahead of planting seasons. When the supply chain is already optimized north of the border, Trump's tariff threats start looking less like leverage and more like a tax on the system he cannot replace. Russia and Belarus are still major potash players on paper, but sanctions and geopolitical constraints have narrowed how much of that supply can move freely into Western markets. Belarus has been constrained by sanctions for years, and Russia's exports face political and logistical friction that makes them a poor fallback for U.S. buyers trying to avoid risk. That leaves Canada in a cleaner position than either of those rivals: open, nearby, integrated, and already wired into North American agriculture. The numbers expose who really controls the market. Canada's tariff trap is already showing up where it hurts most: on U.S. farm invoices, grocery tags, and import bills. In 2025, Trump's tariff escalation sent a shock through fertilizer and food supply chains. And the backlash from farmers has been immediate because the policy is pushing costs higher before a single acre is planted. The first wave of pain has been straightforward. Importers are paying more to land key agricultural inputs, distributors are passing along higher freight and handling costs, and farm groups say the added expense is landing at the worst possible time just ahead of planting and procurement decisions. According to industry reports and farm state complaints, the tariff effect is not abstract policy theater. It is a direct hit to margins already squeezed by fuel, labor, and equipment costs. That is why the political blowback has been so loud. Farm organizations in the Midwest and Plains have warned that tariff-driven price jumps are eroding competitiveness and forcing growers to choose between thinner profits and higher food prices later in the year. In plain English, Trump's move is not just a pressure tactic on Canada, it is a self-inflicted counterattack on the U.S. food system, because the first people forced to absorb the shock are the ones producing the food. And the numbers are not subtle. When tariffs raise the landed cost of imports, retailers do not eat the loss out of kindness, and distributors do not volunteer to take a haircut for fun. They push the increase down the chain, which means higher wholesale quotes, tighter farm budgets, and more expensive staples at the store shelf. That is the part Washington keeps trying to gaslight away. Tariffs are sold as leverage, but in food markets, they often behave like a tax on domestic buyers. The import side is already flashing red. Food and farm importers are reporting higher invoices on products that move through tightly managed North American supply lines, including items that cannot be sourced cheaply from anywhere else on short notice. According to trade analysts, even modest tariff increases can ripple quickly through fertilizer blends, grain handling, feed costs, and processed food pricing because the system is built around speed and volume, not political drama. Farmers, meanwhile, are not buying the spin. They have been blunt that they cannot simply pass the pain to consumers because commodity markets are brutally competitive, and buyers have options when prices climb. A corn or soybean grower cannot just slap a surcharge on a harvest and expect the market to clap like a Karen at a customer service desk. That leaves producers stuck in the middle, with Trump's policy turning into a cost shock that Canada can absorb better than American farms can. Canada is still setting the pace in the fertilizer fight, and U.S. corn growers are the ones getting squeezed as Trump's tariff play pushes costs higher across the Midwest. For producers heading into spring purchasing, the problem is not abstract politics. It is a direct hit to margins. At the exact moment, they have to lock in inputs. Corn is especially exposed because fertilizer is one of the biggest line items in the crop budget, and growers cannot simply cut back without risking yield. Industry economists say nitrogen and potash together can account for a large share of per-acre operating costs, which means even a modest price jump can wipe out profit on already thin margins. In plain terms, if fertilizer gets more expensive, corn gets less forgiving. That is why the tariff shock is landing so hard. Dealers and farm groups report that higher import costs are feeding straight into retail fertilizer quotes, and growers are seeing added charges on top of freight, storage, and financing. The result is a nasty little math problem. The same bushel of corn now has to cover more expense before it earns a dime. Domestic mining was supposed to be the easy comeback story, but the reality is uglier. Building new potash or phosphate capacity in the United States takes years of permitting, environmental review, labor mobilization, and heavy capital spending. And the price tag is not cute. Analysts say new mines can run into the billions of dollars, while production ramps are slow, infrastructure is limited, and local opposition can drag projects out long enough to make the whole thing look like a PowerPoint fantasy. Even when the ore is there, getting it to market is another headache. Fertilizer is bulky, rail-dependent, and expensive to move, which means a mine without strong rail access is basically a stranded asset with a hard hat. That is where Canada keeps winning the game, because its big producing regions are tied into established rail corridors that move massive volumes efficiently into U.S. farm states. Scale is the other cheat code. Canadian suppliers already operate at a size that lets them spread fixed costs across huge output, keep unit costs lower, and serve buyers on both sides of the border without reinventing the wheel every time. Washington decides to throw a tariff tantrum. U.S. producers, by contrast, are trying to rebuild supply chains from a weaker industrial base with fewer existing mines, less rail capacity, and a much longer runway before anything meaningful comes online. That gap matters because corn growers buy on a clock, not a theory. They need product delivered before planting, not after a 3-year federal review and a ribbon cutting with cameras rolling. According to agricultural supply specialists, that timing advantage is exactly why Canada remains ahead. It can ship now, in volume, through a system already built for the job, while America's backup plan is years away and far pricier. Canada still has the stronger hand, but Belarus is the weak fallback everyone notices when the supply chain gets squeezed. On paper, Belarus remains a potash producer. In practice, sanctions have turned it into a constrained option. With limited access to Western finance, shipping, and trade channels that once helped move product at scale, that matters because the market does not reward wishful thinking. Buyers can talk all they want about diversifying away from Canada, but Belarus is not a clean substitute for a system that already has the mines, rail links, and commercial reach to deliver volume on schedule. In other words, the backup plan is still a backup plan, and it is not exactly winning any reliability awards. Canada, meanwhile, is not standing still while Washington tries to rewrite the rules. BHP's Jansen mine in Saskatchewan is moving toward becoming one of the largest potash projects in the world, with first production targeted for the latter half of the decade and a long-run design capacity that could reshape North American supply. That is the part Trump's tariff strategy keeps running into. Canada is expanding, not retreating. The scale of Jansen is the point. BHP has said the project is being developed in stages, with an initial phase designed to add millions of tons of annual capacity and a later build-out that could push output even higher over time. For U.S. buyers, that means the Canadian pipeline is not just holding steady, it is getting bigger, which makes any tariff-driven attempt to reroute demand look more like gaslighting than strategy. Even so, sanctions-driven supply shifts have real limits. Analysts and traders say some buyers will keep testing alternative sources, but global fertilizer markets are not a reality show where you can swap one contestant out and pretend chemistry changed. Potash, logistics, financing, port access, and long-term contracts all have to line up, and that is where weak substitutes like Belarus hit a wall fast. The broader lesson is that selective globalization is replacing old trade assumptions. Governments can threaten tariffs, sanctions can narrow options, and companies can chase new routes. But the market still favors the suppliers with scale, infrastructure, and political room to move. Canada has that edge now, and the next phase of the fertilizer fight will show how far that advantage can stretch before the old rules fully break. Canada is still steering the potash fight, and Donald Trump's tariff answer is starting to look like a policy boomerang that could raise food costs, tighten supplies, and weaken Washington's bargaining position. The problem for the White House is not just optics. Fertilizer markets move through contracts, shipping windows, and planting schedules, which means any tariff shock does not stay in a political press release for long. It shows up in procurement decisions first, then in farm budgets, and finally in grocery bills, where the impact becomes impossible to spin away. That is why Canada's position remains stronger than Trump's response suggests. Ottawa and Canadian producers are not being forced into a corner. They are operating from a supply base that still matters to U.S. agriculture and from an export system built to move volume when buyers need it. Trump can threaten disruption, but the market still has to function, and that gives Canada leverage the tariffs do not. A race. For U.S. buyers, the immediate risk is a squeeze on planning, not just pricing. If import costs rise or supply routes get more complicated, fertilizer dealers and farm operators have to decide whether to absorb the hit, pass it on, or cut back on applications. None of those options is good for yields, and none of them helps the administration claim victory in a fight it framed as strength. The longer-term risk is even bigger. When the United States uses tariffs against a supplier it still depends on, it can end up reducing its own negotiating power instead of increasing it. That is the part Trump's team keeps running into. Canada does not need to panic to stay ahead because the underlying trade structure already gives it more room to wait, more room to sell, and more room to let the pressure settle back onto the U.S. side. Food security is where the policy starts to look expensive in a hurry. Higher fertilizer costs can ripple into corn, soy, wheat, and livestock feed, which means the pressure does not stop at the farm gate. It moves through the entire food chain. And once that happens, the political story shifts from trade toughness to household affordability. That is also why the tariff strategy may backfire in the one place voters notice fastest: dinner. If the White House keeps treating fertilizer as a leverage game, it risks creating a real-world price problem that farmers cannot absorb indefinitely and consumers cannot ignore. The next shock could hit dinner tables nationwide. Washington expected Ottawa to buckle after imposing 25% tariffs, but Canada did not move the way U.S. officials assumed. In the opening phase of this trade fight, Ottawa stayed calm, absorbed to the pressure, and began shifting its economic leverage away from the United States. That was the first problem for Washington. The tariffs were supposed to force a quick retreat, not trigger a reset. Instead of panicking, Canadian officials treated the pressure like a stress test and started looking for ways to reduce exposure to the American market. In plain English, the strategy was not to beg for relief, it was to build options. For years, Canada's trade model leaned heavily south, with the U.S. as its dominant customer and political reference point. That arrangement gave Washington leverage, and the Trump team clearly believed a hard tariff hit would be enough to bring Ottawa to heel. But the reaction from Canada suggested something different was happening behind the scenes: less dependence, more diversification, and a colder read of the relationship. Canadian policymakers began signaling that the old playbook was over. Instead of treating access to the U.S. market as a guarantee, Ottawa started framing trade as a question of resilience, not convenience. That meant pushing harder on domestic capacity, widening export routes, and preparing for a future where American pressure would not automatically dictate Canadian decisions. The shift mattered because tariffs are not just taxes, they are a test of whether one country can force another to absorb pain faster than it can adapt. Washington assumed Canada would fold under the cost. But Ottawa's response showed a government willing to take the hit, measure the damage, and redesign the map. That is the part Trump's team missed. POV. The whole bet was that Canada would panic, call for a deal, and come back to the table asking for permission. That did not happen. Instead, Canada started behaving like a country that had already decided the relationship needed a reset, not a rescue. And that is where the real story begins. Canada was never playing the role Trump assumed. For nearly 3 months, Mark Carney quietly assembled a parallel trade framework with Europe, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and China, according to officials familiar with the effort. The campaign was not announced as a grand reset, but as a series of separate conversations that, taken together, pointed to a deliberate strategy: reduce Canada's exposure to the United States while keeping the economy moving. The timing mattered. As Washington leaned harder on tariffs and pressure tactics, Ottawa was already working multiple channels at once, treating trade diplomacy like a portfolio instead of a single bet. That approach gave Canada room to maneuver, and it made the U.S. threat look less like a knockout punch and more like a badly timed bluff. In Europe, Canadian negotiators focused on energy, critical minerals, and industrial supply chains, areas where both sides saw room to deepen cooperation without waiting for Washington's permission. In Japan and South Korea, the emphasis was on advanced manufacturing, clean technology, and stable market access, with Ottawa looking for partners that valued predictability over political theater. Mexico was part of the same calculation, offering a North American hedge that did not depend entirely on the U.S. market. China was the most delicate channel, but it was not ignored. Canadian officials kept the line open on agriculture, commodities, and broader commercial ties, even as political tensions remained high. The message was simple: Canada was not going to let one relationship, however important, define the entire trade map. POV. That is what strategic diversification looks like when a country stops acting like a customer and starts acting like a state. Carney's team did not advertise the full scope of the effort while it was being built, which is exactly why it landed with force later. Quiet diplomacy gave Ottawa time to test relationships, compare leverage, and identify where Canada had real negotiating power. It also meant the government was not improvising under pressure. It was already moving pieces into place before the public saw the board. By the time the strategy came into view, the shape of it was hard to miss. Canada had spent weeks and months stitching together a trade network that could absorb shocks, redirect exports, and blunt Washington's leverage if the tariff fight escalated. Then Canada revealed the network all at once. Just days after unveiling a sweeping set of trade deals, Canada signaled that it could cut its dependence on the United States by nearly 40% within 2 years, according to officials and industry briefings tied to the plan. The moves target lumber, energy, and pharmaceuticals, three sectors where Ottawa sees immediate room to reroute supply and reduce Washington's leverage. The package is not a symbolic gesture. It is a practical attempt to move volume fast, with Canadian exporters lining up alternative buyers and logistics channels before tariff pressure can harden into long-term damage. In lumber, that means pushing more product into Europe and Asia, where demand remains steady and buyers are already looking for non-US supply. Energy is the bigger prize, and the math is blunt. Canadian officials have been working to expand contracts with European utilities and Asian refiners, betting that long-term supply security will matter more than political noise. POV, when the market wants stability, it usually does not care about Washington's latest tantrum. Pharmaceuticals add another layer to the shift. Ottawa has been encouraging manufacturers to diversify sourcing, production, and export routes so that finished drugs and key inputs do not remain tied so tightly to the U.S. market. That is not just a trade adjustment. It is a risk management play dressed up as policy, and it lands hard because supply chains do not wait for press conferences. The scale matters because it changes the conversation from retaliation to replacement. Canada is no longer talking about absorbing shock and hoping for the best. It is talking about building enough commercial distance to make U.S. pressure less effective, sector by sector, contract by contract. For Washington, that is the part that should sting. Tariffs are supposed to force compliance, not accelerate a neighbor's exit strategy, and this one is already moving from theory to execution. The U.S. economy started feeling the shock. That mattered because Washington had built its strategy around the idea that Canada would eventually need access more than the United States needed patience. But the longer the standoff dragged on, the more that assumption looked like a bad bet. The White House was still talking tough, lawmakers were still debating limits, and Canada was still moving on its own timeline. POV. This is where the whole thing stopped looking like a pressure campaign and started looking like a system error. Trump's advisors had sold confidence. The market delivered consequences. Congress smelled the risk. And Carney kept his distance. Washington was losing leverage in real time. Canada has emerged from the tariff standoff with a sharper sense of strategic autonomy, leaving the Trump administration with fewer clean options and more political risk as global trade continues to shift on its own terms. By refusing to panic, Ottawa turned Washington's pressure campaign into a test of preparedness, and the result was not a quick concession, but a broader recalibration of leverage. That shift matters, because trade fights are no longer being decided only by tariff rates or presidential threats. They are being decided by which governments have already built alternatives, lined up partners, and absorbed the cost of waiting. In this case, Canada did not just endure the pressure, it used the time to reduce exposure, widen its options, and make the United States look increasingly reactive. For Trump, that leaves a worse menu of choices. Escalate further, and the economic damage deepens while Congress keeps asking why a president should have so much unilateral power over tariffs. Back down. And the White House risks confirming what markets, lawmakers, and foreign capitals are already noticing. Pressure without preparation is just noise. The broader lesson is brutal and simple. In today's trade environment, preparation beats intimidation, and countries that move early can force even the largest power to negotiate from a weaker position. Canada's response showed that strategic patience is not passive at all. It is leverage built in advance. That is why the end of this fight does not look like a return to the old order. It looks like the start of a new one, where allies hedge faster, supply chains diversify sooner, and political theater matters less than operational readiness. The balance of power has already shifted. The economic fallout hit quickly in the next fiscal quarter as fractured supply chains pushed construction costs up 17%, while Michigan and Minnesota faced higher energy prices and tighter shortages. According to industry and state-level briefings, the impact was not limited to one sector or one border crossing. It spread through materials, fuel, and delivery schedules, turning a trade dispute into a broader cost problem for businesses and households. Construction firms were among the first to feel it. Delays in imported inputs and rerouted shipments left contractors paying more for lumber, steel, and equipment, with project budgets getting squeezed before ground was even broken. That 17% jump was not a rounding error. It was the kind of increase that forces developers to pause bids, renegotiate contracts, or pass the pain straight to customers. The energy squeeze was just as blunt in the upper Midwest. Michigan and Minnesota saw higher utility costs and periodic shortages as suppliers adjusted to the new trade pattern and scrambled to replace disrupted flows. POV. When the system is built on seamless movement, even a small break can start acting like a Karen at the checkout line, slowing everything down and making everyone pay for the drama. Officials in both states warned that the pressure could linger if replacement routes and contracts did not stabilize fast enough. Manufacturers, hospitals, and large commercial users were all watching the same thing. Whether the next shipment would arrive on time and at a price they could still stomach, the market was not gaslighting anybody here. The numbers were doing the talking, and they were ugly. For businesses, the damage was not only about higher bills, it was about uncertainty, the kind that makes planners hold back hiring, delay expansion, and protect cash instead of betting on growth. That is how a trade shock becomes an investment shock, then a jobs problem, then a political headache. Warren Buffett called it an expensive lesson. Inside Washington, advisors badly misread Canada's political and economic posture as lawmakers on both sides of the aisle began debating whether any president should be allowed to impose sweeping tariffs with so little restraint. The White House was also trying and failing to secure a direct call between Donald Trump and Mark Carney, a sign that the usual leverage game was slipping out of Washington's hands. The miscalculation was simple and it was costly. Trump's team had treated Ottawa like a smaller, more reactive partner that would eventually come back to the table on Washington's terms. Instead, Canadian officials kept moving methodically, refusing to give the administration the public confrontation it wanted, and denying Trump the easy optics of a leader under pressure. That left the political fight in Washington exposed. Members of Congress started asking whether unilateral tariff power had gone too far, especially after the economic damage was already visible in multiple states. The debate was not just about trade policy anymore. It was about whether one president could keep using tariffs as a blunt instrument while the costs landed on businesses, workers, and consumers. Behind the scenes, the administration was also running into a basic diplomatic problem. Carney would not play the role Washington expected. Trump wanted a direct call that could reset the narrative and put him back in control of the conversation, but the phone line never delivered the result he wanted. According to officials familiar with the discussions, the delay only deepened the impression that Ottawa was not scrambling, not blinking, and not begging for relief.